An ordinary repair visit turns into a chilling mystery when Aaron Jacobs steps into Mrs. Langley's home, only to find her frail, trembling, and wrapped in blood-stained bandages. But what truly unsettles him is not just her appearance, it's what she's hiding. Aaron Jacobs, a seasoned repairman, had walked through countless homes and met all kinds of people, but nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for what lay beyond that door. He knocked, expecting the usual shuffle of feet he'd grown accustomed to when visiting elderly clients. Only silence greeted him. Frowning, he knocked again, harder this time, his knuckles rapping against the worn wood. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity before the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Langley, a woman he'd met only once but remembered well. Yet the figure before him was nothing like the sprightly woman he recalled. She stood hunched, her frail body trembling, as if even standing was a battle. Her once bright eyes were now dull, her neatly pinned silver hair hanging in greasy strands around her sunken face. But it wasn't just her disheveled appearance that sent a chill down Aaron's spine. It was the bandages, thick, yellowing, wrapped tightly around her arms with dark red stains bleeding through the fabric. His stomach tightened. His first instinct was to ask, to offer help, but her weak smile stopped him. She didn't want that conversation. "Sorry for the wait, young man. The heat is on the fritz again, isn't it?" Her voice wavered, but she forced the words out. Aaron hesitated, his gaze locked onto the bandages. "Mrs. Langley, are you sure you're okay? Those bandages—" She waved him off with a trembling hand, her movements sharp but exhausting. "Nothing to worry about. Just a little fall in the garden. I'm fine, really." The effort to reassure him seemed to drain what little strength she had, and Aaron wasn't convinced. Something was wrong, very wrong, but he wasn't one to push. With a slow nod, he stepped inside. Yet the moment he crossed the threshold, an unsettling feeling gnawed at his gut. The air inside was thick, heavy, and wrong. A simple repair job turns into a chilling puzzle when Aaron Jacobs steps into Mrs. Langley's house. The air is thick with decay, her frail body wrapped in bandages, and something upstairs creaks in the silence. But the real horror? She doesn't want him to know. The air inside carried a scent of dampness and decay, wrapping around Aaron like an unwelcome presence. The house was dim, its curtains drawn tight, shutting out the sunlight that might have cut through the oppressive gloom. "Just in here," Mrs. Langley murmured, motioning toward the narrow hallway leading to the heater. She walked ahead of him, her movements slow and unsteady, one trembling hand gripping the wall for support. Aaron followed, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the unsettling state of the house. Dust lay thick over worn furniture, untouched and forgotten. A pile of unopened letters sat abandoned on a small side table near the entrance, their edges yellowed with time. Every detail, her frail form, those bandages, the neglected home, tightened the knot of unease in Aaron's stomach. He knelt by the heater, focusing on the repair. But the eerie silence around him pressed in. The only sounds were the occasional creak of floorboards and Mrs. Langley's labored breathing behind him. Yet, an inexplicable feeling crept up his spine, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Glancing over his shoulder, he found her slumped in an old armchair, her hands resting in her lap, wrapped in even more bandages. Her breath was heavy, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "Are you sure you're all right, Mrs. Langley?" Aaron asked gently. "I could call someone for you." Her eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment, He swore he saw something flicker in her expression. Fear. "No need for that, dear. Really, I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice trembled, lacking conviction. She shifted in her chair, wincing at the movement, as if even speaking drained her strength. Aaron worked quickly, but his mind wasn't on the heater. It was on Mrs. Langley and the unshakable wrongness of the house. He gathered his tools, ready to leave, when something made him stop. A sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, a slow, rhythmic creaking. From upstairs. He stilled, listening. Mrs. Langley noticed, her body tensed, her hands clenching in her lap. Then she sat up a little straighter, forcing a smile. Too quick, too forced. "Thank you, Aaron," she said hurriedly. "I appreciate you fixing the heater. It gets so cold in here at night." Aaron didn't move. "Is everything okay upstairs?" he asked, his voice careful, his ears still straining toward the sound. "Everything's fine," she snapped, the sharpness of her voice slicing through the tension. But even as she spoke, she flinched, clutching her side as if the outburst had physically hurt her. Immediately, her face softened, and she shook her head, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm sorry, dear. It's just been a hard few weeks. I haven't been myself." Aaron nodded slowly, but the weight of the moment pressed heavier on him. He could feel it, her desperation, her urgency to push him out before he saw too much. But what was it she didn't want him to see? The bandages? The eerie noises from above? The sealed-off upstairs? Everything about this house whispered of something worse than she was willing to admit. He hesitated, one foot poised between leaving and staying. Aaron lingered in the doorway, caught in a battle between duty and instinct. His job was done. He could walk away, pretend everything was fine. But the uneasy feeling gnawed at him, a whisper in the back of his mind telling him to push further. Mrs. Langley clearly didn't want him digging any deeper, but how could he just leave? Before he could make up his mind, her voice softened, carrying a quiet plea. "Please, Aaron, I appreciate your concern, but I'll be all right. I just need some rest." Her dull eyes held a sadness that words couldn't mask, a quiet, unspoken pain that settled deep in Aaron's chest. He swallowed hard, forcing a reassuring smile, despite every instinct screaming at him to stay. "All right, Mrs. Langley, but if you need anything at all, you call me, okay?" She nodded weakly, her gaze dropping to the floor as though the conversation had drained what little energy she had left. Aaron stepped out into the afternoon air, the door clicking softly shut behind him. He took a deep breath, but the strange, musty scent of the house clung to him, refusing to let go. As he stood on the porch, his eyes drifted up to the second-floor window, curtains drawn tight, concealing whatever lurked beyond. That creaking sound. Was it still happening? Shaking off the unease, he made his way to his van. But even as he drove away, his mind refused to leave that house. The image of Mrs. Langley's trembling hands, the bandages, the stifling silence, it all lingered, a heavy weight pressing against his thoughts. Something was wrong, and deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he saw that house. Mrs. Langley sat motionless in her armchair, her breathing shallow, her hands resting weakly in her lap, wrapped in even more bandages. Aaron hesitated, his concern growing by the second. "Are you sure you're all right, Mrs. Langley? I could call someone," he offered gently, careful not to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a fleeting moment, something flashed in them. Fear. It was gone just as quickly. "No need for that, really. I'm just fine," she insisted, but her voice wavered, betraying her words. As she shifted in her chair, she winced, the movement clearly painful. Aaron forced himself to focus on the heater, but his mind wasn't on the repairs. It was on Mrs. Langley, on the stifling unease that clung to the air. Something was very wrong. He packed up his tools, wiping his hands absently, his thoughts racing. Then he heard it. A sound. Faint, nearly swallowed by the heavy silence, a slow, rhythmic creaking coming from upstairs. Aaron froze, his pulse quickening. He glanced at Mrs. Langley, and her reaction told him everything. Her body stiffened, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for something. Then she forced a smile, but it was too quick, too rehearsed. "Thank you, Aaron," she said, her voice oddly rushed. "I appreciate you fixing the heater. It gets so cold in here at night." Aaron didn't move, his ears strained for the sound again. "Is everything okay upstairs? I keep hearing—" "Everything's fine," she snapped, her voice sharp and uncharacteristically forceful. The air in the room seemed to constrict. She winced immediately after, her hand flying to her side, as if the outburst had physically cost her. Then her expression softened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry, dear," she murmured, shaking her head. "It's just been a hard few weeks. I haven't been myself." Aaron's grip tightened around his toolbox. He could feel it now, her desperation, her quiet plea for him to let it go, to walk away before he saw too much. But what didn't she want him to see? The bandages, the noises upstairs, the way she kept trying to usher him out. It all pointed to something far worse than she was letting on. He hesitated, standing half in the doorway, torn between leaving and pushing further. Every instinct told him not to walk away. But then, her voice softened again, almost pleading. "Please, Aaron, I appreciate your concern, but I'll be all right. I just need some rest." Her dull, weary eyes held a sadness he couldn't quite place, a kind of pain that clung to her like a shadow. Aaron swallowed hard, forcing himself to nod. He didn't believe her, not for a second. "All right, Mrs. Langley, but if you need anything at all, you call me, okay?" She nodded weakly, her gaze dropping as if the conversation had drained the last bit of her strength. Aaron stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind him. The crisp afternoon air hit him, but he still felt the weight of that house pressing down on him. The scent of damp decay still clung to his senses. His eyes drifted up, the upstairs window, curtains drawn tight, silence stretching too thick. That creaking sound, was it still happening? A shiver crawled down his spine as he made his way to his van. But even as he drove away, the image of Mrs. Langley's frail, bandaged hands and the eerie silence of that house refused to leave his mind. Something wasn't right, and deep down, he knew this wasn't over.